Cool. So arrays 2. Okay, so as you can probably tell, these classes or rather these sessions are meant to build on top of one another. I think yesterday we talked about the basics of arrays, but really what we ended on was just, hey, here are a list of functions that all arrays have come pre-built into it. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. Here are all these functions that are pre-built into the arrays class in JavaScript, which means that whenever we use an array, we have access to things like push or pop or slice, etc. Today is actually going to be very much more the same in the sense that we're going to be talking about more functions that exist within the array class in JavaScript, and also talk a little bit about nested arrays as well. So, okay. So kind of going on with the theme from yesterday. Yesterday I think we ended or it was one of the second to the last one of the functions we covered was called dot splice dot slice with an L, right? SLICE, and that was for us to make a copy of an array, right? We tell it where to start and where to stop. Today we're going to start by something called splice with a P. If you get the two confused, don't worry. I still get them confused too. And usually before I use one or the other, I usually go on W3 resources or at least Google just kind of what the syntax is, right? So don't get too hung up on having to memorize these two. Just know that they exist and that there's a clear difference between the two. And the difference is quite pronounced, right? Because whereas slice copies an array and returns the new array, it's very safe, right? Because you're making a copy of something and then editing it. Splice with a P, what we're talking about today here, actually mutates the original array. And what it does is it can add or remove elements from either the middle or from anywhere in the array, including the middle of the array. If you remember yesterday when we did push, pop, shift, and unshift, that only allowed us to add or remove elements from the beginning or the end of the array. Dot splice kind of removes all those limitations and basically says, I will change the original array for you, and I will be able to change it basically anywhere in any place. And so going through the arguments list, the first argument is still the index. The second argument becomes the number of elements for us to remove from the array, starting at the provided index. And so if we look at just at its capacity to remove things, right? On line 9, I have an array called names with George, John, Thomas. And if I say let single-term precedence equals names.splice 1, 1, in a very kind of, very clear sense, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page here, right? When I call names.splice, the first argument is a 1. And that means start at index 1, which is John, okay? The second argument then is 1 again, which says, and that tells us the number of elements for us to remove from the index. In this case, I am starting at index 1, and I am removing one element inclusive of the index that I start at. And so essentially what that does is it takes the name array, George, John, Thomas, starts at John, and removes one element, including John, which basically means we remove John. And then we return the values that were removed in a new array. So a lot going on there, right? So if I now look at names, what I've done is I've taken George, John, Thomas, and removed the John element. And so on line 13, when I console.log out names, what's left is just the array with two strings, George and Thomas. On line 14 then, is the variable that I use to actually capture whatever elements I removed. In this case, I removed one element called John, and so I get back an array with one element, John. If I didn't remove anything, then I would still get back an array, except the array is empty. Okay, so once again, just to kind of really drive this point home, because I know there's a lot going on here, right? What dot splice will edit the original array the way that you wanted to edit it, and then it will return back an array of all the elements that were deleted throughout the course of that process. And so here I have an example where I just removed an element. But then what if I actually want to remove multiple elements? Well, same exact idea, right? Here I have a names array with Paul, George, John, and Ringo. I do the same as before. I call names.splice. I still start at index 1, which in the case is George, and I choose to remove two elements. In this case, George, inclusive of the first element, and then John, the second element. And then I store the output from that in a new variable called across the universe. And oh, sorry. And so now when I console log out names, it's just Paul and Ringo that's left because I removed George and John. And then when I console log out across the universe, I get back an array of all the elements that were removed, which in this case are the two strings, George and John. And then lastly is what if I want to add elements at the array as well? Sorry. So if I go back to what I had earlier before, I still have an array of 4 names. In this case, it's Paul, George, Pete, and John. On line 5, I do names.splice. I start index 2, which is the 3rd element, so Pete. I remove 1 element inclusive of Pete, which basically means I remove Pete. And then where that position was before, I insert whatever the rest of my arguments are. In this case, Ringo, right? And so the argument list, the full argument list for splice is actually unlimited in the sense that you can have as many arguments as you want. The order is always going to be the first argument is the index in which you start. The second element is the number of things you're taking away. And then every argument after that is going to be a new thing that you insert at that position. And so here we're only inserting one thing, which is Ringo, right? And so now if I look at the names array, again, what I've done is I've taken Paul, George, Pete, and John. I've gone to Pete. I've removed 1 element, which is Pete, and I've inserted Ringo in its place. And so now on line 7, when I console log out names, I see Paul, George, Ringo, and John. And then if I take a look at line 8, where I look at what the former members array is, what I've done is I've taken 1 element, which in this case is Pete that I've removed, and I've stored that element in a new array, which captures all the elements that were removed, which in this case is just an array with 1 element of Pete. And then to kind of really drive the point home, now we kind of get a little bit creative with it. Here, if I want to use this splice function purely as a way to insert elements and not take anything away, well, the short answer is all I have to do is just go to if I look at line 5 there, all I have to do is go to the index. I put in 0 as my number of elements to delete, and then I insert, in this case, 2 items, right? So now I have 2 arguments plus 2 more arguments of the things I want to add in. And so now when I console log out names, it's a much bigger array with 6 elements. And if I look at the elements that were removed, I still get back an array, except in this case, it's just an empty array because I didn't remove anything. Any questions here? Splice is more or less the most powerful array method we're going to cover in this section. Just kind of keep in mind that it will allow you basically to add or remove any number of elements from any position in the array. The dangerous parts of it are that obviously 1, it modifies the original array, so you want to be careful. And then 2 is just that it can take as many arguments as you want, right? So there's no set number of things it has to take because the number of arguments you give it is dependent entirely upon how many more things you want to add into the array. So any questions before we move on to the rest of the array functions? Okay, cool. All right. The next method we have is a join method. This one's a little bit more straightforward. All it does is it assumes that whatever elements you have in the array, all it does is it takes it together and adds it into a single string. This creates a brand new, the return value is a brand new string, so it doesn't change the original array. And so if I look at here, if I look at line 4, I have a names array. When I do names.join and I store that new output under join string, join string is just going to be, it's going to assume that whatever elements you have, it's going to try converting it into a string. It's going to try casting it into a string for you. If you remember the lesson from last week about casting and changing object types. And then in this case, by default, what it does is it combines all of those elements and separates them by a comma. So here, if you look at the printout on the top right-hand corner of your screen, we have Paul string, George string, John string, Ringo, right? And we didn't print out here, but the names array is not changed. The join element by default joins everything. The join function by default joins everything with a comma. But if you insert any new string in there as a separator, it will basically replace a comma with whatever you insert. And so here, if I look at line 3 here, when I call names.join, instead of leaving it blank and defaulting to the comma, what I do is I insert a string that's space and space, right? And so now when I look at the join string, it's Paul, space, and space, George, and John, and Ringo. So basically, it's a nice handy way for us to convert whatever we want into usually a human readable string. I would say is the most practical use case for it. And we can obviously use the argument to figure out how we want to join them, right? What kind of text we want to insert in the middle. So that's join, and it's once again it's pretty safe because it doesn't modify the original array. It just returns back a brand new string. Similarly, another way for us to kind of combine multiple things is something called the concat method. The concat method, what it does is it actually joins in multiple arrays, right? And all it does is it says, hey, if you have 2 arrays and you want to just take those 2 arrays and combine them into one array, concat is the method that you want. One of the most common ways I see people get tripped up when they use concat is they assume that. So the way you call it there on line 9 is you say the array you want to come first. In this case, it's called the older array. You call it older.concat, and then you pass in the second array, or the array you want to come in the second part, or you want to join to this into the second half. The place where people get really tripped up here is that when you call older.concat younger, what you're actually doing is you're combining these 2 arrays into a single array, and you're returning that brand new array, right? Like you're giving back a brand new array. And so you're not impacting older or younger, you're actually creating a brand new array, and so therefore you have to store that new array into a new variable. In this case, we call that variable altogether now. I've seen plenty of people try to say, oh great, older.concat younger, and therefore the older array is now changed. But that's not true, right? Older is not changed, younger is not changed. When you call older.concat younger, all you're doing is returning a brand new array, and that new array has to be captured in the new variable that you can then use. So basically, if you're not capturing the return value out of concat in a new variable, effectively there's no point in calling it because you can't use that variable anywhere. Okay, so concat once again just merges or just combines 2 arrays into a single array, and the array that is calling the function, in this case older, comes first, and then the array that's being passed in this case younger, is added to the end of the first array. Then you need to call it kind of sequentially, right? So if you want to add another array called medium to the end of the younger array, then you would need to do altogether now .concat medium. Concat does. There are other more advanced functions, including the spread operator that lets you pass in multiple arrays at once, but it's not something that we want to cover here necessarily. But so there is an elegant way to do it, but concat is not the way to do it. Yeah. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up our section on the different array methods here. But one of the things that that we also want to kind of talk about before we wrap up this session on arrays is actually this idea of nested arrays, right? So nested arrays are essentially they're basically lists within lists, and it may seem a bit confusing, but so we just want to kind of make sure that when you see it, you don't get too tripped up by it. Here on line 3, we have this variable called the related things. And if I look at related things, on the surface of it, it looks like an array with 4 elements, right? Windows, Mac OS, New York, and Chicago. But one of the things that we really want to be careful about here is that the related things array, it actually only has 2 elements, right? It doesn't have multiple elements, and so it doesn't have 4 elements. It only has 2 elements, and each of those 2 elements is an array. Okay, so so if so this is 1 element, right, comma, and then this is our second element. So the related things array only has 2 elements because there's 2 things separated by 1 comma, right? The difference now is each of those elements, in this case the 2 arrays I just highlighted, they also have 2 elements. And so this is what we call a nested array, in the sense that it's not an array with a list of things. it's an array with a list of things that also includes other things. And so the way for us to access this is actually very similar to the way we access strings, in the sense that we still use our our bracket notation. On line 5 there, if I want to call console.logout related things index 0, that just says print out for me the first element in the related things array. Remember, the first element is still an array. And so if I look at the first printout, it's an array. I print out an array with two things, Windows and Mac OS. On line 6, if I keep following kind of my nested format here, then I say related things index 1, and then I add an index 0 to the end of it. Now what it says is, hey, go to the element at index 1 of related things, which in this case will be this array here, right? And then go to the first, or the element index 0 of that, which is New York. Okay, and so once again, when we look at this, we always read code from left to right. And so all we're saying is, hey, great, if I look at line 6 here, right? First thing we do, go to related things, which is this massive array. Next thing we do is go to the element at index 1. So this element here. And then once we're in there, now let's go to the element at index 0, which is just this element here, which is New York. And last but not least, just to confirm, if I do related things.length, I get back a length of 2, because once again, there are only 2 elements in the related things array. And so why is this useful? Well, one of the things that we actually also want to be, and we'll walk through this slowly, but one of the things that we really want to be careful about when we use nested arrays is just to make sure that we actually know kind of what's in the array. And so here, if I take a look at this example, I have this big array up top here that's called RSVP groups, and it contains multiple things, right? I know it contains one of two possible things. It either contains strings of names, or it's going to contain an array which also contains strings of names, right? Think of this maybe as like an RSVP group. Think of it as almost like a wedding invite, right? Like if someone RSVPs by themselves, they show up as just a single name. If they're bringing a partner along, then those two people become kind of one array or one item, if you will. And so the challenge here is to say, well, what if I want to print out every single name in this array? If I try to do what we normally do when we try to go through every single element in the array and just print out, it actually doesn't work very well for us, right? Because if I print out the first element of RSVP groups, it's not going to print out Jane. It's going to print out this array, Jane, Mel. And so therefore, I'm printing out multiple things at once. Instead, what I want my outcome to look like is just like this, right? Jane is its own item. Mel is its own item. Jack, Rohan, David, Meg, all the way through. And so how do I do that? Well, I still use my for loop now, but now I just need to be extra careful, okay? So on line 3, I'm still going through, on line 3 here, I'm still going through this RSVP groups array the way I normally do, right? I start at I equals 0, I is less than this array.length, I plus plus. And then I just make sure I take a look at each element, right? In this case, I save whatever that is at the index of RSVP, I save it under the variable element. Here on line 5 is kind of where the magic happens, right? Where I say, hey, let's check to see what type element is. And once again, I assume that either element is an array or it's going to be a name string, okay? If the element is an array, I do all of these things, which I'll come back to in a little bit. But I really quickly just want to go back and say, if element is not an array, so if I go to my else statement, right? If element is an array, I do line 6 through 10. Else, which means element is not an array, on line 12, all I do is I console log out element. I print out the name. And so normally, if I had an array of just strings, this is pretty much my entire function, right? I go through every element, and for every element, I console log out the element, and I'm done. Here, I'm still doing that same thing, but only if the element is not an array. If it is an array, sorry, if it is an array, on the other hand, what I do then is I go into line 6, and I now traverse through this inner array, right? I now use another index variable, in this case I say for j, I'm sorry, I use another index called j, and I say for j equals 0, while j is less than this inner array element, right, dot length j plus plus, I now say let name equals whatever is in this inner array, and let's print out that inner array. Sorry, that inner element, or the element inside the array. And so if I just kind of descriptively talk about what this function is doing at a high level now, I am still going through every single element in this RSVP groups array. For each element, I do a check. If this element is a string, like it is with Jack, I just print it out, nothing fancy. However, if that element is another array, I then go inside that array, or rather I loop over that inner array. In this case, now I print out every element inside this inner array, which in this case is Jane, and then followed by Mel. And now what I've done is I've written a function that can handle an array that can hold either other arrays of strings or the strings directly. And now this will allow me to actually print out everything kind of in one go without confusing whether or not something is an array or a string. Any questions here? Does this make sense, everyone? Cool. So then the last extension of this nested array concept we're going to talk about is this idea of grids. Grids are basically a way for us to represent a two-dimensional figure, right, or a two-dimensional graph. And nested arrays are actually very good at doing this because if you really think about it, the arrays inside other nested arrays can be thought of as the rows of a grid, and then the index then becomes, or rather the index across multiple rows become the column. On lines 7 through 11, we made this grid with three nested arrays. It's a 3 by 3 grid, right? It has 3 rows, and then each row has 3 elements, so therefore there are 3 columns. JavaScript would never print out your nested arrays for you in this way. This is just something that we're doing just so you can see, to make it really clear kind of what's going on, right? It helps you visually understand what's going on, even if this is not how maybe JavaScript visually presents it. Okay, so then if I wanted to get access to any row in this grid, right, it's pretty simple. If I want the first row, it's just grid index 0, right? Because if I do grid index 0, that gives me back this array. If I do grid index 1, so the second row, that gives me back this array, and so on and so forth. So first row is, or rather getting any row is pretty simple. Getting any columns will be a little bit trickier, right? Because if I want to get the first column, for example, I actually can't even highlight it. If I want to get the first column and capture it in an array, I actually need to go to each row, right, and get the element at that column index. And so in this case, if I want to capture just the first column in the nested array, notice how I have to now start by having an outer array first, because I want to capture, if I want to grab a column, I need to kind of capture all of that in a list of values. Okay, so that's why I have the arrays there. And then the first element in my column array is going to be whatever is the first element in the first row, which in this case is 1, right? How do I access the first element of the first row? I go to grid here, I access the first row, and then I access the first item in the first row. And now this will give me back this 1 here. How do I access the second element in my column? I go to grid again, I access the second row in my grid, and then I access the first element in that row, right? Which in this case is, I go to grid, I go here, and then I go here, and I grab this first element. And then last but not least, I go to grid again. To get the third element, I go to the third row, and I grab the first element. And now I've actually gone through every single row individually. I've grabbed the first element, or the nth element that I want, and I've captured all of it in this outer array. And so now when I console log out first column, I see a first column of just 1, 1, and 1. And so this is a little bit more involved. You might need to take a look at this slide and kind of keep it open if you are going to work on a problem kind of in this format. But just know that rows are very simple when you use nested arrays to represent grids. Columns are a bit more involved. And so today for today's workshop, it's just going to be very similar to yesterday in the sense that we're going to be doing more practice problems with arrays. And we're also going to have some nested arrays in their problems for you as well. We've also opened up an optional project for you to work on. It's a Sudoku validator. Don't devote any class time to it today. Today for the class time, once again, just focus on our traditional workshops. But if you go home tonight or this weekend and you have some free time, feel free to take a look at a Sudoku validator problem. Write up a solution, and then if you have any questions or if you want any of the instructions to check it or take a look at it, feel free to submit it to either Alec or John, preferably first, and then if they don't respond, also feel free to send it to me as well. Just know that the optional projects, as the name indicates, are 100% optional. They're purely there as a way for you to get more practice. Okay. So to recap, today we talked about the splice function, we talked about the join function, we talked about the concat function. Actually, one thing that I looked up while we were talking, so sorry for that, is I actually misspoke earlier. I think someone asked a question of what if I want to join multiple things. It seems like the concat function is able to take in multiple arrays to join together. And so if I do older, and I do .concat, and I pass in younger, comma another array, comma another array, it will join all of those things together at once. So that is a way to use concat. I will say that I've never personally seen it used that way, so I think that was my instinct. But I just want to clarify that that is possible. Although I think generally speaking, when I see people try to join multiple arrays, we still do it mostly with a spread operator. So it's possible, it's just not something that I've seen very commonly used. So just want to clarify that up. And then in the second half of the lecture, we talked about nested arrays, right? So this idea of how do we contain other arrays or how do we contain arrays in existing arrays, which is pretty straightforward. But then the harder part is kind of how do we access or how do we use the elements inside those nested arrays. So are there any questions before we get started on the workshops today? Everyone's good?